BlomCast. Turning points in history. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm really excited to greet Natasha Wheatley to the podcast. Natasha, hello.
Hi, thank you, Philip, for having me.
We've had many turning points that were more and less life and death questions. You've written a book that is a life and death book, The Life and Death of States. This has to do with what it means to be a state, what it means to be a modern person, but it also has to do with the place that I'm living in, with Vienna, because according to you, and that brings us to our turning point, Vienna is really, and the creation of the Austrian Republic, the aftermath of the Habsburg Empire, is really a pivotal point not only in statehood and state building, but also in thinking about states and what it means to have such a thing as a state. But Natasha, let's just start at the beginning, and let me ask you, how does a nice girl like you wind up in a joint like that? How does a political American political scientist become so fascinated by Habsburg statehood in Central Europe?
Well, it may make your question even sharper because I'm not American, I'm Australian. I grew up in a place called the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney.
Oh, yes, now I hear it.
Yes. You know, these things are always mysterious, I think, even to ourselves. But some roots into this topic include the fact that I came of age in Australia in the early 1990s when the major question on the political agenda was Indigenous land rights, right? We had this movement much earlier than in the United States. And there was a very significant court case called the Mabo decision, which overturned the legal foundation of Australian sovereignty and said that this whole idea of terra nullius, according to which the land belonged to no one, making it available for British colonization.
Was uninhabited, yes.
Exactly, was untenable, and that Indigenous people had owned the land and that something of their title had survived colonization. And it's rare, of course, that court cases completely overturn the foundation, also of that court's authority, at least in theory. And unsurprisingly, the more radical potential of that decision was blunted over the years. But nevertheless, it threw into the public sphere some very dramatic questions, not only about the relationship of different sovereignties, but also about the ways in which rights might survive over time and survive through empire. And I think I not only became very interested in those questions through that experience, because the question of Indigenous land rights in Australia was the moral issue, right? We don't have the same legacy of slavery that you do in America or say in Germany of Nazism. The question of Indigenous dispossession really occupied that position of a sort of foundational national crime that needed to be reckoned with. So the importance of these questions seemed very clear to me, but I also became fascinated by the sort of malleability of law. What does it mean to say that these rights have survived these 200 years, even though no one noticed? And the sort of fantastical things then that law could do with time. And so I became very interested in sort of legal reality, I guess you could say, the sort of fictions that law produces in order to achieve the outcomes it desires.
Shared fictions.
Yes, exactly. Law, like all disciplines, has its own fictions, like economics. We like to think of ourselves as very modern and disenchanted and scientific. But all of these fields presume abstractions, which are projections.
But are laws anything else than shared fictions?
They have very real-world consequences which go beyond the fictional.
So do fictions.
Absolutely. Take the idea of a right. It doesn't exist in the world. We ascribe it, So no, absolutely. It is an agreed system of collective fictions that we think of as an appropriate way of organizing society. But I think it's actually worth acknowledging the fact that we have created it. It doesn't exist separate to us.
Which also means, for instance, that we can change it if we feel like it.
Absolutely. I think that's an emancipatory creed. Exactly. That actually by owning those things rather than just presuming they exist prior to us means that the responsibility is with us to correct them too. Absolutely. Alongside that sort of Indigenous story, I also maybe it's a product of our still a sort of colonial imprint to Australian education. But I grew up kind of obsessed with Europe and thinking that this was where real politics, real history, real art happened, and was just eager to get there as soon as I possibly could. And so I did. I left first when I was 18 and went and lived in Germany for a year and learned German, and I became very interested in sort of thinking about German-speaking Europe, in the world. And my advisor at graduate school at Columbia here in New York was Mark Mazauer, and he's someone who's very good at thinking about East Central Europe as an alternate vantage point on the sort of British and French view of the continent. And so I think somehow all of these things together produced this rather idiosyncratic book.
I want to come to the book, but so many things that you say. I mean, when you talk about Indigenous rights, you must have had your own thoughts about the referendum around the voice in Australia, where it was rejected that the Aboriginals even had a consultative representation in the legislative process in Australia. But you also, it was kind of fascinating to how relaxedly we now talk about the fact that laws are shared fictions, because of course for most people in most times they came down from the gods, or at least they were natural law, and Mother Nature itself made these laws, and we just had to read them. The idea that we are now happy to discuss that these are just stories that we tell to each other, isn't that enormous sea change?
It is. I mean, I should also say that I'm an historian, so I have the disciplinary advantage of not needing to reproduce. I'm not a lawyer. I don't need to sort of. It's not my professional duty to preserve these things and their majesty. But I think that's actually a very important vantage point too, because lawyers do need to be structurally invested in the reproduction of their field. And there's an argument to say that we need to presume that laws have a certain sort of majesty, or that come from a source that's higher than ourselves, in order to give them the authority that we want them to have. So these things are complex. And certainly, as you know, that's sort of one of the themes of the book. Like if sovereignty used to be based on a right ultimately given from God, right, the divine right of kings, it had a huge store of majesty and sort of mystery and power from which it could draw. And as we move away from a world of divine right, we have a legitimacy problem for law, where we can't easily just tap into some automatic fount of its authority in the same sort of quasi-magical way. And so, hence you have the dramas of the founding of modern polities, where we're trying to anchor that in other things like the right of the people. But that idea is a natural law proposition too. The idea that, people have the right, again, from some unknown source, but just because of their own existence, that's another sort of fiction that we've needed then to put in the place of the God one. And so there's sort of no easy way out of some of these problems. You also asked about the voice. I mean, there was a proposal in Australia. Essentially, Indigenous Australians were only given full citizenship in 1967, right? So this is a very recent history.
Which you would almost just have to say again, just for people to realize that, yes.
Exactly. I realized I needed exactly to step back. So, from that point onwards, we have an evolving discussion about how to sort of integrate them more structurally into the polity. They're an extremely disadvantaged community with really high imprisonment rates and the sorts of social problems.
Alcoholism.
Exactly. So this is it's a serious social equity issue, apart from a legal and philosophical one. But as with all of these things, there's no easy and obvious way to solve them. So the idea that there should be some special constitutional recognition of the status of Indigenous Australians, runs into not only a sort of fearful right-wing opposition, but also you could say a more radical Enlightenment or progressive one that says, no, we need a universal order, not one that actually works in these identity or ethnic blocks and cleaves off segments of the population and says they have different rights, but rather an order that maintains its universalism. So as ever, there's a fierce contest of ideas then about the best way of thinking about diversity within the state, and different forms of diversity is is how do we conceptualize the place of Indigenous Australians as against Australians from other parts of the world? These different, ethnic groups, inherently different? Are we sort of then essentializing and then perhaps even orientalizing Indigenous Australians to say that they have a special status that's different to everyone else's? So there's a very, you could say rich, but certainly very fierce debate about the best way of proceeding. But the most powerful thing about The Voice was that, through a painstaking process of grassroots collaboration over many, many years, a really incredible team of Indigenous leaders and politicians and scholars devised this proposal for constitutional reform. Because it's also worth emphasizing that there isn't one Indigenous people in Australia, right? There were some, more than 150 Indigenous nations prior to colonization. This is a huge continent. There are so many different peoples, different languages, that inhabited it. And so even just drawing everyone together into a common, blueprint was a huge and laborious task. And the fact that they were able to agree on this vision, to me, gave it a huge amount of moral authority. And so then that was taken as a referendum to the Australian people, and they rejected it, in no small part due to a really horrible scare campaign by our Conservative Party. So that was, I think, a very tragic moment for a lot of Australians. But that struggle will go on in other ways. But it is in some ways this whole question of how to think about peoples and states. It's a long one, and even if the book is geographically far afield, it's dealing with some of those same questions.
Well, it takes us around the world, because from Australia we are now going to a place that no longer exists on a map, which often makes it kind of difficult for people to sympathize with it or to find that it was a vibrant place and a real place. The Habsburg Empire has vanished from the map. Many people are not quite sure where it was. So it was a Central European empire that basically reached from Romania to Switzerland and from northern Italy to Germany, covered roughly 20% of the European landmass at the time. So a big place, a very important place. But come the 19th century, what for you made it so interesting? What made it really stand out from the other countries around it?
Yes, so as you say, this was a huge polity that really straddled the middle of the continent there, and was obviously a great power. It was integral to the European balance of power for centuries, really. And so it was actually this real symbol of continuity. A very long-standing dynasty that had also, from most of its history, worn the crown of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation too, right? So it's really woven into European dynastic politics at the very center. Come the 19th century, what's interesting is that, of course, this was an extremely multinational polity. It was a polity characterized by incredible diversity, both language use and religion. And that hadn't been a problem before. That was how all polities were to a greater or lesser degree. But come the 19th century, you have the rise of both liberalism and nationalism, two forces or perspectives on the world that seemed fundamentally opposed to the dynastic order that the Habsburgs had. And two ideas that we really associate with political modernity, right? Liberalism and nationalism.
Never mind socialism.
Exactly. Well, it comes a little bit later, but exactly. So in this mid-century moment, if we sort of take the revolutions of 1848 as a little bit of a starting point, because that's when this really combusts. We've had this slow building of these ideas in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and they've tried to sort of prevent their spread. This is the post-Congress of Vienna world, which is a reactionary, a restorationist order, which is trying to stave off these forces and the ideas of popular sovereignty that come along with them. But that really combusts in 1848. And you have revolutions across the continent, as I'm sure most of your listeners will know. And so at that point, the empire looks very shaky. It really does almost collapse.
Paradoxically, because, today, when you look at today's politics, this is a curious thought, but nationalism was an emancipatory, progressive movement.
Yes, it's important to read. Yes.
Because those were people who were thinking against the state as a monarchy, as various people sort of swept together under one big mantle, because that was just through dynastic politics and who had married whom and who had won which war. All these different peoples were now higgledy-piggledy under the same ruler and had to obey him. It was usually a man. And this thought was, no, we've got our own identity, we've got our own history, we can stand up for ourselves, we don't need this medieval institution on top of us. So it was then a progressive thought.
Absolutely. Also, in a sense, I think it's important to stress not just around those identity questions, as important as they were, but also just through the idea of democratization, right? I mean, to say that the authority of the state should be based in the nation is to say that it should be based in the people, right? Rather than a sovereign, just to put a slightly different gloss on what you said. So it's part and parcel of this democratizing worldview that says, no, people should participate in politics and shape their political reality, that this shouldn't be this sort of top-down affair. So absolutely, and I think you're right that we can lose sight of that today when nationalism has a bit of a bad stench in many circles. That this was an idea, very much of emancipation, and it's worth saying that sort of one of the most important nationalists of that sort of mid-19th century moment, right, Mazzini, the famous Italian nationalist. He doesn't see nationalism like we now do as a principle then of inevitable warring parties, right, or a zero-sum game of making each country great again. For him, this should actually be a principle of international peace, right? He thought precisely if you give each nation its own sphere in which to realize itself, it will have a sort of and participate and be invested in the order, right? It's a bit of a sort of, there's a Republican sort of set of virtues that for him come along with this. Then you will have a sort of, everyone will be sort of sated and will be happy to get along with their neighbors because they've got their place. They don't need to sort of struggle against, something. And so he saw this as a real principle of international peace too. He saw internationalism and nationalism as working in the same direction rather than being necessarily opposed, which is interesting. Having said that, of course, the nationalization of politics as was proven in the 20th century, but even as some people were already saying in the late 19th century, had many, unfortunate consequences too, because once you begin to say that politics is based in the nation, and that one particular group, whether defined ethnically or linguistically, has a particularly privileged relationship to the state power and the state authority, then all of a sudden there is something called a minority, right? You don't have minorities in this 19th century world because you don't have majorities, right?
You just have subjects.
Yeah, or nationalities was the language, right? The Habsburg Empire has some 10, 11, 12 different nationalities. None of them is a majority, and so you don't have this majority-minority logic, which we very much see really roar then into the center of public life in the interwar period. And so it's no accident that even before then, in that, say, the 19th century sort of debates around these questions, it was, often, for example, Jewish Habsburg subjects who saw, how dangerous this nationalization of politics could be. For example, for them, they knew they had nothing to win, actually.
Unless, of course, they were Zionists.
Which comes a little bit later again.
Yeah, but, which in the late 19th century is also an attempt to make the Jews fit into the same logic.
Absolutely. In a different part of the world.
Namely, a people must have a country. Yes.
Absolutely. And it's no accident that so many of the key thinkers of the Zionist movement come out of the Habsburg lands or the Habsburg and Russian lands, like this sort of East Central European, pressure cooker of this question of how to align peoples with state borders, which we can really see as the big drama of this whole century from 1848, to 1948, you could say, where everyone is trying to figure out what's the best relationship of those two things. And Europe, of course, and the Middle East cycle through several iterations over that 100 years in an attempt to get it right, and in the process producing the map that we have today.
Now, you must help me out with something, because On the one hand, people often make the argument that the Habsburg Empire was effectively a medieval state that had survived into modern times. What could possibly go wrong? And whereas, Germany, Italy, to some extent France, Poland had very strongly congealed around nationalist ideas and national ideals and political models, Habsburg was muddling on as this state of many peoples, this Vielvölkerstaat, only really united by the emperor and his family as the one idea that brought them together. Now, what could possibly go wrong, especially as nationalist ideas seeped into the Habsburg Empire and very strongly gripped peoples there, who, not only the Hungarians, but also the Bohemians, and yes, also some Jews, and certainly the German-speaking peoples, and the Italians in Tyrol, etc., etc. Now, this seems like a recipe for trouble, and indeed it was, as we know. On the other hand, there are many people who look today at Europe and say, what's the problem having all these different countries in one large unit? After all, we've done it before. There was the Habsburg Empire, and that worked so well. So how does this work out?
So yes, this is the fascinating thing about history, that it's such a rich and complex archive that every age can dip back into it and draw out different sorts of lessons and insights. And that doesn't mean that it's all relative and that anything goes, but that any large process is multi-causal and complex. And so there's always sort of something new to learn or a different perspective to cast on something, which keeps us professional historians endlessly busy. So the first story that you laid out there about, the Habsburg Empire as this inevitable medieval relic that, of course, was just completely out of place in modern Europe. I'd say that was the story we had about the Habsburg Empire for a good half century following its collapse, right? So for most of the 20th century, the standard story was that, yes, this was completely out of keeping with modern needs and with modern ideas. And the interesting thing about that story is that we now understand that it was produced in part by the nationalist leaders and movements who were trying to establish these successor states in the wake of the Habsburg Empire's collapse, right? So rather than presume that, as people did for a long time, that these nation states were sort of the natural or inevitable product of history, we now see that they had to be really hard fought for, hard won, and they were very precarious. And so there was a huge intellectual effort to try and explain why these states were necessary or legitimate. And so to do that, they had to denigrate the Habsburg Empire. They had to say, we've been in this prison house of nationalities, and now we are liberated. And so they had a vested interest in presenting the Habsburg Empire as backward, because that in turn set up the legitimacy of their own states. So these are Czechs, these are Hungarians, and so on. And so because then nationalism really also shaped the historical profession, we sort of accepted these narratives as sort of true or objective. And things really have swung back a little bit in recent decades, where I think we have a bit more distance to that nationalist view of history, precisely because of, the violence that it's engendered over the course of the 20th century, where we can see now that, hopefully it's a little more balanced. So I think that some people go too far in the other direction and have quite a nostalgic view of this multinational Europe, where all these different peoples lived in harmony together. But I think even if we hold back from that sort of rose-tinted glasses view, there is still much sort of, fruit for thought and reflection, because this was a pretty successful multinational polity, in the sense that, yes, there were inevitably deficiencies in different domains, but this was a largely peaceful, ordered society that actually thought a lot about how to make space for these different versions of diversity or different national cultures, especially, in that second half of the 19th century and first part of the 20th century until it collapsed. So, for example, from largely the 1860s on, you have the constitutional recognition of the equality of all languages. and this slow rolling out of rights on that basis, so that everyone was entitled to schooling in their own language. So imagine that for a minute now in a country like America or something, that the state would guarantee public schooling, in some 10 different languages. You could talk to the state in your native language, whatever it was, and the bureaucracy would sort of deal with that. Commanding officers in the army were required to speak the languages of their soldiers. So the army was a profoundly multilingual and multinational institution. So it went a long way to thinking about how to give institutional shape and form to this multinationality, and to assure some basic sort of equality of civic rights inside that. So and it also had a very interesting layered governance, where you had imperial agencies and agencies of the different lands running alongside one another. So that wasn't a terribly efficient system, but it did actually give the regions substantial autonomy. So the empire was governed differently in each of its different parts. Again, that's one of the things that for a long time counted as its profound, backwardness, because it wasn't a legally homogenous state. But another way of seeing that is that it allowed for, local autonomy, and for different people to have their needs met in different ways that didn't impose one order from above. Because yes, on the one side we have a king, but it's funny, that could be a looser authority in some senses too. The nation state, with its Enlightenment ideal of complete legal equality, flattens those things. It's one of the costs of that, emancipatory universalism that we otherwise celebrate. So I think, as you say, in this day and age, people are thinking again about federalism. I mean, most prominently perhaps via the EU, but just more generally, how do we live with difference, right? And what are the political institutions that are appropriate for that? And I think the Habsburg Empire is pretty interesting to a lot of people, again, for that reason.
I mean, it must be very interesting, especially if you're in Europe at the moment, because we have, thanks to Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin and other prime examples of humanity, moved back into the 19th century, effectively into an imperial world. And a world of imperial spheres of influence, which mean necessarily that a country takes over other territories, if only for their resources. That's how colonialism functioned, financed itself, and today it's resource colonialism to some degree. See Venezuela. Europe can't play that game. Also, Europe actually doesn't want to play that game. But, it also doesn't have a natural sort of hinterland that it could regard as its colony, as its sphere of influence. It's just this western bit of Asia that's just hanging there. Surely Europe cannot survive if it does not become a federal state that is able to act with weight behind it in this new political constellation. And therefore, it's all the more important to look back at the Habsburg Empire and see this attempt to balance out different claims, different cultures, nationalities, to let them coexist and not flatten them, such as, for instance, the French did, who imposed French on the whole of France where it was not spoken, who would not recognize anything but secular citizens next to each other. And that is also an experiment that has gone very badly. If you look at the influx of Muslim immigrants who were then put in the banlieue, in the outskirts of the cities, where they were deprived of job opportunities or educational opportunities, and where the things happened that made modern France the very problematic place it is today, where this was completely denied by the legal fiction of all Frenchmen being equal in front of the secular state. So surely Habsburg has some interesting aspects to teach us, but on the other hand, it failed because of this very complex setup, didn't it?
Well, I guess to take the last point, I mean, that's actually, there's a lot of literature about that now too. So it's true that our standard narrative before was that, yes, nationalism broke the Habsburg Empire apart, that it fell because of these rising national movements. The sort of line among professional historians today, though, is that really it collapsed because of World War One. All those tensions were there, but it was a reasonably functional polity on the eve of World War One. But 4 years of total war, which imposed such an extraordinary burden on the state, obviously across all domains. This was the new era of total war that required complete mobilization. And as you know all too well, the Central Powers suffered from the Allied blockade, and there was extraordinary hunger. And there's nothing like hunger to undermine the legitimacy of a state that can't feed then its population, you know what I mean, or ensure their sort of basic needs and security. And so I think that professional historians now think that it's that the state suffered a crisis of legitimacy, in part because of factors like that, but also, it should be said, through its own decisions to impose sort of martial law. It became this really draconian state through the course of the First World War, where it closed its parliament, and a lot of the pretty vibrant actually civic and democratic culture that had developed were undermined and completely squashed during the war. So that only further increased the delegitimization effort. And so there's a sense in which it was really the stress of this protracted total war that in the end brought it down.
But I mean, its entry in the war was to slap down a nationalist movement, the Serbian nationalists.
Absolutely, which, exactly to your point, shows the acute sensitivity to these questions of nationalism that existed in the empire. The only way to explain why you would launch a war on that basis is because for them, this whole idea of Slav nationalism did threaten, conceptually, the integrity of the empire. So, no, absolutely. As with all these historical revisions, you never want to take them too far. You know what I mean? You correct the picture, but it always remains complex, which is why we can always debate it, So, and when we say the Habsburg Empire failed, I mean, it obviously survived for centuries, like it failed in the 20th century. That's true. But it's also not like it was a short-lived state. It was quite successful for a long time. And I think it's worth actually thinking about the fact that precisely its disaggregation, right, or its decentralization was a key tool of its success. And actually, if you read the literature on world empire more broadly, that idea of differentiated rule was a key strategy, for preserving imperial power. And so those two things went hand in hand, actually. But to your point about sort of where we are now and, your counterpoint of France, I mean, it's so interesting. In those 19th century constitutional debates in the Habsburg lands, France is always the counterpoint, right? I mean, that is the ultimate centralized state that squashed all those old legalities and regional differentiations, as you said. And so when people from the different Habsburg lands are debating what the empire should look like legally, they definitely don't want to be a département. You know what I mean? They don't want the French centralization that just put people into these standardized and non-historical sort of categories or boxes. They very much want to keep alive their local traditions and culture. They're very attached to the laws and privileges and tradition of the Kingdom of Bohemia, for example, or of Moravia. The identities fold along those lines, in key ways. And so the Habsburg structure definitely made room for that. And of course, that system never stabilized. It is to have a sort of state that is based on that sort of plurality. And it does have a volatility to it. It is a state, a sort of arrangement of constant movement. So over the course of the late 19th century and into the early 20th, that's constantly being renegotiated in ways that are destabilizing. Having said that, as you say, it's not like the alternate model is just a walk in the park either. And so as we see from contemporary France, and so all of these systems have their drawbacks. And it is a bit of a question of which battles you want to have,
Which battles you want to have and which battles you can win.
But actually, sorry, I realized I didn't actually address the first part of your question, which was to do with this question of returning to an imperial world now and the question of Europe's place in this world of great blocs. I mean, what's so fascinating is that, of course, that dilemma of Europe's place in the world has really been, on the agenda over the course of the 20th century. And it was precisely that question of what hinterland, European powers would have that drove schemes, like Hitler's, to develop. He's like, well,
and that was Ukraine. incidentally.
Yeah, and that he's like, okay, so America has the Americas, Russia has this huge Eurasian continent. Where is Germany's?
We won't be able to build a colonial empire anymore in Africa or Asia. Therefore, where can we colonize?
Exactly. So let's turn the continent itself exactly into, because there was this sense that to survive in this great power world, where you have powers on a continental scale, like this rising hegemon of America, you needed that sort of expanse. You needed governance to be on that sort of scale. And there is a way in which 19th century nationalists in the Habsburg lands were aware of that too. So famously, Pulaski turns up at the Congress in 1848 and says, "No, I'm not a pan-German. Like, if the Habsburg Empire didn't exist, we'd need to invent it, because it's precisely this structure that allows all these small peoples to have some standing in the world. Otherwise, they just get gobbled up by these rival great powers. And it's actually joining together like this that we have, can sort of guarantee our existence." But Hitler's defeat didn't remove those questions, and there's a lot of interesting new work on the foundations of the EU, which shows how those early European bureaucrats, even though that's a sort of an anachronistic term, were precisely interested in keeping those links to Africa, because they thought this idea of Euro-Africa, that they were going to need the resources from Africa to prop up this continent. And so we have just different iterations of this question of what sort of great blocks are required to have genuine autonomy in this world. So we are, as you say, at another crunch point for that question, as we seem to be returning quite explicitly to almost an idea of great blocks, with Trump explicitly invoking the Monroe Doctrine again, and both China and Russia asserting rights to their regions in the same way.
Let's retreat to Austria for a moment, and this time really to Austria, because the First World War is over. This has been for Austria a disaster. And the country is not only economically ruined, its emperor has had to resign. I've just done a little bit of work on the Adler family, the Viktor Adler, the socialist leader, and the life and death of states. I mean, Viktor Adler spends his late life working on basically being the grave digger of the Austrian monarchy and trying to end this monarchy, working together with the young emperor Karl, who knows that the empire is lost and he has to find some sort of ordered transition. And Viktor Adler, who's supposed to be the foreign minister of the new republic, dies the day before the republic is declared. Moses at the border of the Holy Land. A really fascinating figure, Viktor Adler, and also his work. But I mean, historically, it's really interesting to see, you look at a map of the Habsburg Empire, a school map, you can still buy them. They're magnificent, they're big and they show you everything. There's no Austria on there. There's Tyrol in there, Carinthia, Upper Austria, Lower Austria. But Austria as an idea does not exist on this map. There is no national identity to it. There is no entity that could be called Austria in any way. And Austria after the war is basically everything that the Allies don't bother to take away, and everything that is of little value in the empire, because really the breadbasket is Hungary and the industrialized areas were in Bohemia, and the German-speaking rump becomes a new state. Now that's a whole fascinating story of its own, but you really dig into the arguments that are made in building this new state, and building not only an identity, but a way of thinking, of approaching this state that nobody wanted, that nobody really foresaw. Many people from the right to the far left, including, by the way, the young Viktor Adler, were pan-Germans who thought their future would be as part of Germany, and Austria really didn't have a right to exist. So fashioning a nation out of that is a conversation of its own and a fascinating part of history, but fashioning the legal fiction of a nation out of that was particularly interesting. And here we come to someone who is much admired by the current president, Alexander von der Bellen, who's got a big bust in his office, and that is Hans Kelsen, a Jewish legal scholar. What can you tell us about him? Just give us a thumbnail sketch of what he was, and especially what he meant for this new idea of thinking about statehood.
Yeah, so Kelsen is a fascinating figure. He is an extremely abstract intellectual, and I think for that reason, he puts a lot of people off, including myself. The first time I encountered him, I was he seemed so forbidding, and so sort of his work seemed so sort of dry and lifeless. But for the purposes of this book, I knew I needed to dig into him a little bit, because he's by far the most famous jurist to come out of the Habsburg lands, and someone who is an uncontested sort of giant of modern legal thought. And like so many of these things, once you actually dig in and try and understand something, it's just absolutely fascinating, and it's anything but dry. And so a big part of this book is actually to return him to a broader sort of history reading public, because he'd really only been written about mostly by lawyers, and they sort of take his significance and his ideas to some extent sort of for granted, and they don't sort of bring their full dynamism and creativity and the way in which they're embedded in all these very political debates and dilemmas. They don't bring that to the fore so much. So Kelsen's born in 1881, so really comes of age in that turn of the century ferment, right? I mean, Vienna is just on fire culturally. It becomes this cauldron of modern culture. Freud is publishing The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. You have Klimt and Schiele sort of reinventing modern art. You've got similar developments in music and in architecture. And all of these fields are cross-penetrating and producing incredible new insights and syntheses that's shocking to, the older generation that's steeped in this 19th century bourgeois culture. And so, this is very much the tale told in Stefan Zweig's, Die Welt von gestern, The World of Yesterday, which, traces the passing of this world in a really powerful way. So one of the things I'm interested in doing in the book is showing how Kelsen's legal thought is part of this big modernist ferment. So I think we can think about the ideas that Kelsen develops as the sort of thing that law does as part of that modernist transformation.
But there's also much more intellectual side to what you described at this artistic transformation. There is the Vienna Circle, there is Wittgenstein, there is the scientific thought of the time with Schrödinger. There's so much happens also in an intellectual way, and especially this extremely analytic approach to philosophy is something that you find back in Kelsen's own writing and work.
Absolutely, and I'm interested in the cross-fertilization of those domains. So I think the scientific and the artistic, really get bundled together in all kinds of interesting ways. Yes, so Kelsen is really thinking about the constitutional problems of the empire there as he's coming of age, and this dilemma of all of these different lands, all with their individual legal orders that precede the empire itself, right? The empire is formed through the joining together of these different lands that leaves those different legal orders intact. So it's a dilemma actually to sort of conceptualize the power of the emperor as some original law when, these lands, had their systems of law prior to the empire proper. And what this has left the empire with is a situation in which it's not like imperial law trumps the law of the different Länder, right, of the different lands. They both have the status as original law. So theoretically, two contradictory laws could be overlapping in their operation. And this is a sort of intolerable status quo for a modernizing legal positivist who wants to see law as a gapless and complete system that could be sort of respectably called a Wissenschaft, a science in that sort of turn of the century sense.
Like mathematics, sort of logically perfect.
Exactly. And so to admit this sort of chaos is to sort of admit that your discipline is not a discipline, not a science. And so you can't go there. So where do you go? And precisely because of all of these overlapping historic claims, to try and work out historical priority, to say that this lawmaking authority is first and paramount for these historical reasons, it's just going to land you in endless historical debates that sort of can't be solved. It's like all these chickens and eggs, and it's a nightmare. So he comes to the conclusion, A, that you do need an idea of what is the first or the highest norm, But you can't actually find that in history, right? You can't actually find that in the material world. Jurists, he says, have to logically presuppose that there is such a norm. He calls it the basic norm, the Grundnorm, and it's just a norm that says other norms can be made. So the basic norm in a constitutional monarchy might be that, or in a monarchy might be that the king makes the law. You know, a basic norm in a parliamentary state might be that parliament makes the law. So it is a sort of invented thing. It's something that only exists, you know, for a logical, only for legal science. It's not something that actually exists in the world. But he says that jurists have to presume this. They presume this every time they make an argument that there is a valid law. And so he says, I'm not making something up in the sense of imagining it. I'm just raising to the surface a logical presupposition that's there in all legal arguments. But in sort of conceptualizing all the problems that law is wrestling with in this sort of abstract way, he gives a new foundation to law's legitimacy and coherence, but also takes law out of the world, you could say, in a sort of quite emphatic way. It is this very, as you say, abstract and logical approach to philosophy that we can connect to the Vienna Circle and others. And so it sort of sets the world on fire. It's sort of very quickly translated, the pure theory of law, as it comes to be known, into Chinese and Japanese and Spanish. And, you know, so it has even in the interwar years, an incredibly global reception. And it's still a key part of legal education in many parts of the world. It has a huge following in Latin America still, and in Scandinavia. That's sort of day one of law school too. So it's both denigrated and sort of you know, people sort of in some ways you get some chuckling about it, especially in our world that wants to view law in much more pragmatic and realist and materialistic terms. But I see him as this sort of high watermark of legal modernism, in that he's trying to figure out what is the basis of law's legitimacy after gods and kings, right? And he says, actually, the only basis we can find for law and for legitimacy and the coherence and the singularity of the state is in logic alone. And I think there's real pathos to that move. And so he's wrestling with these questions precisely as the empire is coming apart. And so I try to connect that drama, because he ends up working in the war ministry during the war. He's part of those proposals to restructure the empire along more federal lines. And so with one hat, and then he ends up, you know, being the most important drafter of the post-war Austrian constitution. He's both involved as a sort of, he's actually writing these states and actually writing these transformations, but he's also at the same time writing a kind of philosophical basis for them in his academic work. And so he's a fascinating person to think about contextually, right, to approach historically, and to replace him in this sort of epochal sort of transformation in the Central European map.
I mean, this is fascinating what you say also when you say, you know, he wants to have recourse only to logic alone. It's sort of the legal equivalent of 12-tone music, where you want to have an objective principle of structuring everything that is not dependent on you. But I want to throw someone at you that who wrote in the 1960s, a very conservative German jurist, I'm certain you know him, Hans Wolfgang Böchenförde, who said something that I find really foundational to looking at today's world, at the disintegration of American democracy that we can see, at tendencies towards the same in Europe. And his famous sentence, you'll know it, is that the liberal secular state rests on assumptions it cannot guarantee itself. And I think that's of such importance, because these assumptions that need to be shared for a state to become possible are something like a minimum of respect, a minimum of tolerance, perhaps some kind of a shared sense of the facts, of a truth. And you can ask yourself what happens to a state when those assumptions are no longer shared, and whether indeed the state then still has anything to rest on left. Isn't that the same with Kelsen's theory of law, that it relies on very strong assumptions? It's a bit like the legal philosophy of John Rawls. It relies on very strong assumptions that are just presumed to be there, of a kind of civilized liberal world.
What's so interesting about Kelsen is that there's a way of saying that he does precisely the opposite, because this basic norm, this Grundnorm, doesn't contain any values. It doesn't say Yes, everyone must be civil or civic. It doesn't say that humans are necessarily like this. It doesn't say that this language or ethnicity is the most important. It doesn't presume any of those social contract sort of things. For him, it's actually an empty vessel that a society has to fill with its own content. So a society has to take responsibility for saying, this is our basic norm or these are our foundational principles. But it itself doesn't have those. It's actually just the sort of conceptual skeleton, that is behind a set of more substantive decisions. So in some ways, it actually, in that sense, you could say he doesn't help us so much with those problems, because in the first instance, he was interested in how to make law make sense, right? To guarantee the coherence of that legal structure, and law is a Wissenschaft. On the other side, he did see himself as a sort of radical Democrat that took democracy extremely seriously. So, a society actually has to go back to law as an emancipatory principle, as we were saying at the beginning, like he says that, a society has to decide for itself what values it wants to put in there. They're not actually ordained from outside. So we have to take a lot of responsibility for establishing that common shared set of assumptions to think with your example here. They don't exist, outside of us. And we can also see in that the sort of legacy of the Habsburg experience, because it's a real dilemma in this period. If you don't want to go, so you reject the divine right of kings, but you also don't want to enshrine a nation as the foundation of a state sovereignty, right? So what do you do? What do you base it on? He has come up with an idea of sovereignty that can include anyone and everyone, right? That doesn't rest on one version of humanity or of human virtues or human, vices, nor does it rest on one particular sort of human in the ethnic or, linguistic sense. And so it is a sort of, also you could say, quintessentially Habsburg philosophy that says, no, the state can rest just on law. And then the politics has to sort out all those questions to do with how people live together. But actually trying to meld those things is dangerous. That trying to base the legal justification for the state on particular attributes or particular groups actually allows, the sort of, mob mentality in part that we see then in the interwar years, and which then so dramatically shaped his life. He was a victim of anti-Semitism, first in Vienna and then in Germany, and had to leave for America as World War II got going.
You make a wider point in your book that is really interesting when you look at today's world, namely states these shared fictions, which only exists in our heads, really, because laws can be drawn, borders can be drawn anywhere. They exist in space and in time. Obviously in space because they fill their borders, but in time also because they are, at least supposedly, they precede us and they will outlive us. And we are living our lives in the context of this longer, wider entity. Now, of course, if you look at the Soviet Union, if you look at former Yugoslavia, you see that that's not always the case. And when I was a student, I had an acquaintance, an old Jewish lady from Romania, who said that she'd lived in 5 different states without ever moving house, which you could do in that area between Romania and Ukraine at the time. But this extraordinary idea that these things can vanish. Also, you make the point how young they are as an idea in history, these abstract states that define us to some extent. But when you look at a moment in history, namely today, when the international order is failing, when an American president says in an interview he does not recognize international law, and that for himself only his own moral sense is his only binding and guiding principle, and we know one or two things about that moral sense. What is happening to this extraordinary fiction?
I mean, in terms of where we're going regarding the permanency of the state, I mean, all of that I think remains to be seen. but it's true that one of the things that the book is exploring is this presumption of what I call state immortality. I mean, I'm not the first to call it that, but this idea that the state as a legal person, as a legal entity, survives through time, unaffected by the rise and fall of different governments, or the particular policies of different governments, or the span of biological lifespans, right? So you have this thing that people come and go, they live and die, but the state stays the same. It has this sort of juridical agelessness. And that's an extremely important fiction for all kinds of very pragmatic reasons, to do with things like state debt and state treaties that we have to presume are going to exist despite these changes. So it's true that law has a sort of preference for the status quo, for stability, for continuities, for precedence, and a sort of structural distrust of novelty. And so it always, I think, struggles with transformations. And, it'll be interesting to watch it try and adapt, to this new moment. It is under so much pressure, international law, and it's far from a sort of innocent discipline. I mean, so much scholarship over recent decades has been to show its sort of structural co-implication, with empire and with a sort of hierarchical legal structure, hierarchical set of power relations between different parts of the world that law has been relatively untroubled by. So there's also no point in, I think, valorizing that international legal order as some sort of paradise from which we are now departing. It's justified and enabled a lot of inequality. Having said that, one thing that can really be said in international law's defense, and I think that it's a reason to really hold on to it and to celebrate it, is that it is, by this point, inevitably produced by multiple voices. It is not just one person or one country's rule. It has been co-authored at this point and has become the language that we use to try and figure out what are common standards or are sort of commonly understood to be the right principles through which to govern the relationship of states. And it's precisely that sort of patchwork nature, or that international law, as something that many of us have come together to try and thrash out over decades at this point, it might be a sort of a thin thing, it doesn't mean it has some, again, meta-historical virtue, and yet it's much more than we have when we look at the world through the lens, of these great world-shaking autocrats at this point, with figures like Putin and Trump. And so I think we want to defend the right. We want to defend law. It's a tricky position for us because, faced with these sorts of existential threats, we can, I think, retreat into our own sort of set of storytelling about these institutions and want to put them on a pedestal that they might not necessarily deserve. We sort of need, strong but subtle justifications of the world we want that don't mean that we are, positing a sort of fantastical world that also never existed. American governments have been pursuing their own interests, for a long time now. It is this new world, though, the nakedness of that pursuit. And so we might say that I think we're on the sort of lip of a new relationship of words and actions, right? I mean, a lot of legal fictions to do with human rights and humanitarian intervention and so on are sort of being stripped back, and we're being forced to re-examine the relationship of those sorts of justifications, with the realities of power. And so it does feel like there is something very structural afoot, and no one, certainly not this historian, can tell us exactly where it's going to end up.
Natasha, I don't know what you're working on now, but I'm really, really curious to find out. That, however, will be another conversation. I thank you for sharing your thoughts and your time with us, and for taking us from the Habsburg Empire right into today and into the question whether a slower, more collaborative way of developing your common fictions and the laws that flow out of them may not be a better way forward than the diktat of the biggest boy in the schoolyard. Natasha Wheatley, thank you very much. Natasha, the author of most recent Life and Death of States, a really wonderful and thought-provoking book. And thank you all for listening. This was the BlomCast, the first one of the new year. There'll be many more to follow. And thank you again to Natasha Wheatley. Philip Blom says, come back and goodbye for now.